Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking to you about research posters. So we're going to talk about what they actually are, and then we're going to talk about the different steps that you can go through to make them. So let's start off with what they are. You've had a brief introduction to them in the science communication part of the course, but I'm going to give you a bit more context about how they work. Research posters are kind of what their name suggests. They are giant posters which summarize a research project. They may just be one or two studies within a broader research project, or they might even just be the methods of a project that's been proposed to kind of get feedback. But the whole point of them is that you can kind of summarize what your research is about and present it to other scientists in a way that's very quick and is really easy to get feedback on. So this is how research posters are normally presented. They're a feature of conferences, which are basically just giant meetings where loads of scientists will get together to talk about research linked to a certain topic. And the posters are normally a dedicated session within these conferences. You can see here that this is basically just a giant hall with loads of boards, and the posters are stuck up on the boards. From a distance, they kind of all look like infographics, and that's not entirely far off what they are. They're basically just infographics in a certain format that scientists understand really well. Now, what happens at these poster sessions is that you will stand there with your poster and people will kind of walk around all of them. And you have a very brief period to try and convince them that your poster is interesting, that they should listen to what you have to say, to give them a kind of brief elevator pitch, and then to have a discussion about the research. That elevator pitch normally involves pulling out the most interesting bits of the poster. So that might mean kind of a very brief overview of the introductory parts and how you actually conducted the research, but then a real focus on the findings that you got and what those findings mean. If you're looking at this and going, wow, this looks terrifying, you're right. It is honestly so scary just having world famous scientists walk past you and take a glance at what you're doing. But it is also really nice because you get loads of opportunities to interact with other people who can understand what you're doing and can give you some really, really helpful feedback on it. You can probably see based on the signs that are around that this is like a geology/physics conference. Normally, psychology conferences are not this big. You do get big ones like this, of course, but the kind of ones that happen in Europe are a bit smaller and a bit more niche. So you might have the board set up in the lobby of a hotel, for example. Don't get me wrong, it's still terrifying. There will still be like 100 people walking past, but it's not quite on this scale. So how do these posters normally work? Well, they're normally divided into kind of standard sections, and those sections are the header, introduction, methods, results, conclusions, and references. So starting off with the header. Now, this is a section for basically promotion. You start off by promoting yourself, so your name, your affiliation, so that's normally the university you're at, and then any contact details that you might think be helpful. A lot of scientists use Twitter, so they might link to their Twitter account. They might link to their personal website, and then they'll also put the names and affiliations of their co-authors. So these are anybody that they've done the research in collaboration with. So for students, that normally means the person who's supervising your research, some kind of professional researcher who knows what they're doing and can advise you on what you might be doing wrong. You also want to put logos for any organizations that have made it possible for you to do this research. You also want to put the logos for any organizations that helped you conduct the research. So, for example, the university that you're based at, or any organization that sponsored your research. So, for example, I'm doing my PhD at Queen's, and my PhD research is funded by the Northern Ireland Department for the Economy. So, whenever I do a poster, I always have to make sure that there is a logo for both the School of Psychology at Queen's and the Northern Ireland Department for the Economy. Next is the introduction. So this is where you summarize how you got to the point of conducting your research. This might mean summarizing existing research, and it can also mean linking to other sources if that's how you came to your research idea. So for example, news articles are sometimes really good ways to highlight the relevance of your research question. In psychology, we normally center our research questions around a problem that we're trying to solve. So you want to summarize what the problem is, why it's a problem, and how you got to the question that you're at. Say, for example, I'm conducting a research study about conspiracy beliefs linked to vaccinations. In the introduction for that study, I might write what anti-vaccine conspiracy theories actually are. So, for example, how we conceptualize them in psychology. I might write why they're a problem. So, in this case, belief in those conspiracy theories is associated with decreased intentions to get your children vaccinated, which can be a massive problem for the children because it means they're at an increased risk of contracting really serious diseases. And those diseases can potentially have life-altering consequences. And then I might link to a news article about a new type of anti-vaccine conspiracy theory that's going around. Once you've summarized these kinds of things, you then need to outline what your research question is. And if you're doing some kind of quantitative research, then you need to also specify your hypothesis. This helps other scientists understand where you're coming from with this, and also lets them work out whether the methodology you're using actually fits what you're trying to test. Next is the method section. So this is basically where you summarize what you're doing. You'd normally have a few bullet points in this section. It shouldn't be too long, but it needs to have enough detail that another person can understand what exactly you're doing. So you need to summarize your research design. So if you're running an experiment, what are the conditions in your experiment? What is your control? What kind of extraneous variables are you controlling for? If you're using questionnaires, you need to state that, and you also need to provide a citation to any questionnaires that you're using. That lets other scientists kind of go back and check whether you're actually using the questionnaire word for word and whether it's a kind of reputable one. You also need to specify who the participants are. So where they come from, what kind of age they are, the gender breakdown, things like that. You would report these in aggregate scores. So, for example, you might just say that the participants were recruited in Northern Ireland, they had an average age of 35, and 70% of them were cisgender women. And then if you're using any kind of special measures or equipment, so for example, if you've got more complex experimental setup, then you need to include enough detail to kind of understand that. So, for example, on the right here, this is an EEG. So it's a type of equipment that measures activity in the brain based on electrical responses. And if you were reporting for an EEG study, then ideally you need to have some kind of description of how you measured that data and then how you processed it. It's completely fine to include diagrams and things like that. Actually, sometimes a kind of visual presentation of the method can be really, really helpful, especially if people are kind of stood a bit further back and are struggling to read your bullet points. The next section is generally the results. So this kind of does what it says on the tin. You just outline the most important findings from your study. In most cases, you want to take those key results and you want to report the statistical tests. So, for example, if you were just measuring the averages, then you want to report those averages. And you also want to have a one-sentence summary just describing those findings without referring to any numbers. So, for example, if I ran a statistical test and found that one group had a significantly higher score in conspiracy beliefs than another group, then I want to describe that in a sentence, maybe along the lines of Group A had significantly higher conspiracy beliefs than Group B. It can also be really, really helpful to put graphs into this section. Again, the kind of visual representation of your findings just makes it so much easier to understand, especially if you're in a crowded, busy room and you can't really read what's on the poster, or you're struggling to hear what the person is saying. Having a graph can just make everything make so much more sense. Next is the conclusions. So this is where you kind of drive home what the findings actually mean. How do those findings link to existing research? You know, we have these theories in psychology that try to explain human behavior, but what do your findings mean for those theories? Do they add more evidence in favor of them? Is the evidence just kind of neutral? Can you not really tell? Or maybe even they disconfirm the theory. You need to make it clear what those findings mean in that kind of situation. You should also explain how your findings can be applied in the real world. So that means things like how they can inform policy. Say, for example, those anti-vaccine conspiracy beliefs. If you maybe find that a certain group are more likely to believe those conspiracy beliefs, then you can tailor the information about vaccines towards that group. So imagine that we ran a study and we found that expectant mothers were more likely to be anti-vaccine, and that kind of came from their concern, their anxiety about how it might affect their child. We can then use those findings to go to healthcare workers and say, okay, these are the people that are really, really worried about vaccines. You need to spend longer explaining how they work to these people. Your conclusions should also explain how this opens up new areas of research. So, for example, maybe there was a gap in the methodology of your study, or maybe it's found a new correlate that could be tested experimentally. Sometimes we can even run studies that get what we call a null result. So we try and do an experimental manipulation and it just does nothing. It just doesn't work. If that experimental manipulation is something that we've known for a long time works, then getting a null result is surprising, because it should work, but it didn't. So that might suggest that there are maybe some groups of people that this doesn't work on, or there are some situations where this doesn't work. There are some specific applications that it doesn't apply to. These are the kind of things that you need to address in order for other scientists to understand how important your work is. Generally in research, you want to demonstrate what we call impact. So that can be impact on science. How did your findings change what we know? And it can also be impact on society. So how did it change the way that we do things more generally? How does it change people's daily lives? And then finally, we need to list our references. So as you've been going through your poster, you should have been citing previous research. It's really, really important that we credit the work that made our own research possible. So that can mean previous research in your area that has informed the direction that you've taken. It could mean, for example, questionnaires or experimental methods that you're using. And what you want to do is cite them in the text when you mention them, and then provide a reference list at the end with full details of how to find that work. In psychology, this is normally done in what we call APA style, but it really does depend on the conference and personal preference. The important thing is that the work is in a list for other people to find and you've credited them appropriately. Not crediting people's work properly is considered a really serious academic offence, so it's really important that you get to grips with this.